Hi, I'm Gary Wockner. You're watching EarthX TV, and this is our first episode of Overcoming Overshoot. And today on the show, we are delighted to have the editor of the book that has inspired this show, Tom Butler. This book is massive. It's 5 times the size of my head. It is a coffee table book of pictures, and they are unsettling pictures, titled Overdevelopment, Overpopulation, and Overshoot. Thanks for being on the show, Tom.
And it's my pleasure, Gary. Glad to be with you.
Tom, this is a kind of just start right out. This is a coffee table book of just amazing pictures. And I'm just going to, open one here. And they are, for the most part, see how big it is? It's like huge to fit across your coffee table. Just amazing pictures. And they are mostly unsettling pictures. And I just want to do a quick check-in. When I was younger in college, there was a book by the World Watch Institute. And it was called The State of the World. Do you remember that book?
Sure. It was an annual series.
They put it out
every year.
Yeah, they put it out every year, and it was full of numbers and statistics and graphs, basically chronicling the demise of the planet more than anything else. But you chose a different path, to do this coffee table picture book. Kind of tells a similar story, but it's all with like images and pictures. So, just tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book and why you decided to go with images and pictures, and what you hope to achieve with it.
Well, you're absolutely right. We did make a conscious decision to use this format of a large format coffee table book rather than a litany of statistics or trends or charts or policy papers. If you look at the literature in the field of population going back decades, there is no shortage of policy papers or analyses of demographic trends. There's no dearth of technical information, academic primarily, and insular really in that field. But does that actually move a popular conversation? Not so much. You just referenced that's wonderful series of World Watch Institute publications, which were fabulous, and they were highly read. They were well read within the conservation and environmental communities, and I think they percolated some out into the policymaking world in Washington, D.C. during the years that those were published. But they never had a large popular audience. They never drove a national conversation about sustainability. I'm not saying that we necessarily had the aspirations for the book that we would, but we wanted to at least give ourselves a fighting chance that we could meet regular people who had never thought about this issue necessarily, and affect their kind of emotional center of the brain, not the rational center of the brain. That was the rationale behind the photo format.
And you're the author, editor, co-editor of more than a dozen books, including Wildlands Philanthropy, Plundering Appalachia, Protecting the Wild, and Energy, Overdevelopment, and the Delusion of Endless Growth. This book is a little different format than those. You're also the former editor of Wild Earth Journal. And then you took over at the Tompkins Conservation, which is, of course, down in Patagonia in Chile, and worked with that organization for a long time. Do you feel like this book, how is it different from some of your other efforts, and why do you think it has made a little bit difference in the way that it's reached to the public?
It was a natural culmination of the publishing program that the foundation was operating for years and years. I'll sort of digress a little bit with a little bit of history.
Yeah, please.
Late Douglas Tompkins, my former boss and mentor, was an absolutely brilliant business person and conservationist. People who may not know his name probably know the companies that he co-founded, the North Face initially. And then he actually became a very wealthy person when he started the fashion company Esprit. Those of us who are old enough to have a little bit of gray in our beards remember walking around in the 1980s when every 14-year-old in North America needed to have a T-shirt that said Esprit across the front. And consequently, that was Doug Tompkins and his first wife, Susie Tompkins, creating a fashion brand that became a global powerhouse. But after Doug Tompkins was also a mountaineer, adventurer, climber, and he was spending several, besides running his company, he was spending several months of the year out on expeditions, kayaking or climbing around the world with his buddies, Yvon Chouinard and Rick Ridgway and others. And everywhere he went, he saw what? He saw that the wild world was being degraded. It was being eaten slowly, and the wild places that he'd been to before, when he went back, they were not so wild. They were shrinking and he was also a pilot. So he saw a lot of that degradation of the natural world as wild habitat was lost to the creeping sprawl of industrial humanity. He saw that from the air. And there's no better way to understand how wildness erodes than from above. So all of this is percolating in his mind, and he eventually just got tired of business and said, I'm selling my half of Esprit. And he took that money and he endowed his initial foundation, a family foundation called the Foundation for Deep Ecology. It's since been subsumed into a larger NGO called Tompkins Conservation, which now works primarily, as you noted, on creating new national parks in South America, Chile, and Argentina. But at the time he first started the foundation, he was a traditional grant maker supporting groups in the US that were helping to protect public lands, helping to fight off wildlife destroying activities. And he also started a publishing program. He was inspired by the late David Brower. You remember those coffee table books that the Sierra Club put out in the 1970s?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Those exhibit format books that Dave Brower published, that was when Doug Tompkins was a young guy, and he found those incredibly compelling. That idea that you create essentially a campaign centerpiece in the format of a coffee table book. So the Foundation for Deep Ecology, since its inception, when Doug first started up, was producing large format coffee books, and then doing associated grant making to NGOs, primarily scrappy little wilderness defense groups, on those particular issues. He first published a great book called Clear Cut, the subtitle of which was The Tragedy of Industrial Forestry, about how clear cutting was destroying so much of America's forests, particularly on public lands. And from there, there was this series of large format books, usually kind of focused on a particular issue: industrial forestry, public lands grazing. We published a book on mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia called Plundering Appalachia. And gradually, as I was running the publishing program for Doug, for the foundation, we started zooming out. Those first few books were really narrowly looking at a particular issue: industrial logging, industrial recreation, public lands grazing. But we started to zoom out, and then we produced the book that you mentioned about energy, and how the entire toxic energy economy is driving both biodiversity loss and this climate crisis that we face. So we were getting a little farther afield, and the commonality with these books was the industrial worldview behind the activity, behind the culture that was participating and driving these activities. And the natural accumulation of zooming out and having your lens broaden was a book like Over, that didn't look at the symptoms, but the root causes, which is exactly what we're talking about with ecological overshoot: how human numbers, it's population, and human behavior, it's the development factor. You add those things together, and what do you get? Overpopulation, overdevelopment, you get equals overshoot.
Yeah, and so that listeners know, one of our goals on the show is to have hard conversations, to talk about some hard truths, and so we just edged right into the first one, and I actually I wasn't completely telling the truth. There is one graph in this book, and only one, and it is the picture or the graph of human population growth on the planet, and it is a classic hockey stick graph.
Yeah.
And then I also want to mention there's a quote right at the beginning of the book, and I'll read it. And it's by one of my heroes, a guy named Al Bartlett, who was a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, which is my alma mater. There's a quote here by Al, and it says, "Can you think of any problem in any area of human endeavor on any scale, from microscopic to global, whose long-term solution is in any demonstrable way aided, assisted, or advanced by further increases of population, locally, nationally, or globally?"
Yeah.
And I had I knew Al just a little bit when I was in grad school at CU Boulder, and I had the pleasure of seeing Al very near the end of his life do one of his classic slideshows. This was like, I think it was in the early 2000s, and computers had been invented by then, and the internet existed. But Al showed up at this event, and it was a political event, and he showed up. He was the guest speaker. And he showed up with his overhead projector and his transparencies, and he went right through it, as he had been doing for 50 solid years, telling the story of overpopulation and exponential growth, which was, of course, his favorite topic.
Oh, he was brilliant at that. I've seen that I never saw it live, but I've seen tapes of him with those overhead transparencies. He was just a peerless educator about exponential growth, just making that real for people. He was a marvelous man,
and he was a great guy. And of course, so we've edged into the first official, extremely controversial topic on the show, overpopulation. And of course, in the book too, you hit the other controversial word, the G word, growth, over and over and over. So just talk to us a little bit about population, overpopulation, and growth. And you mentioned that you think it is sort of the root cause, and why you think it's the root cause, and why you think we don't talk about it anymore.
Well, you've gotten there's 3 or 4 questions in a row there.
Yeah.
We could talk for days about any one of those. Let's start with the beginning of the fact that we put one chart, that one hockey stick graph of human population growth basically in the frontispiece of the book. And after that, no charts. We tried to be a statistic-free zone in this book, again, and go right to imagery that was showing how the Earth is being transformed by human numbers and behavior. Almost like as if you were seeing a slideshow of just a snapshot of the Earth and the way that industrial humanity, 7.8 billion people on Earth, is transforming the biosphere. So very simple, very clean. But we included that chart because it is so, when you see that classic hockey stick graph and the exponential growth, you realize that this is an amazingly recent phenomenon. This is all really new. The world, as we look around, you may go through your day and you think, well, this is just how the world is. This is a normal thing. It's not normal in human history. It took all of our history as a species, depending in between 1 and 200,000 years of anatomically modern humans, and the several million years before that of our closest ancestors. It took all that time for the human population on Earth to reach 1 billion people. And that was about the year 1800. And then what happens? So throughout the vast majority of human history, growth was not something that human communities experienced. Human population was incredibly stable. One demographer, leading demographer who's written about this, calculated that sort of pre-industrial growth rate was something like 1/500%. So it would have been imperceptible for a person, for a human being, through really pretty much any human time period until very recently, to experience this feeling of rapid expansion of human numbers. So this is all very new. And then something happened around the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Should we talk about what those factors were?
Yeah, quickly, yeah.
Yeah, well, obviously, a few things happened. One, we got much better at controlling our death rates through modern science, germ theory, public health measures, kind of understanding of how disease worked. So science, germ theory, modern public health all of that contributed to lessening death rates and longer lives, which is a good thing. But we didn't necessarily control our fertility at the same rate. And then another sort of magical windfall occurred, which was the exploitation of fossil fuels, which have allowed us to essentially grow vast amounts of food, store it, process it, transport it, and kind of in almost a magical way, because fossil fuels are so energy dense, allowed us to project the kind of power onto the rest of the biosphere and the rest of our relations in the community of life that was unprecedented in human history. And that's where you see the rapid escalation in human population growth, where the curve goes like this.
You know, I remember watching Al Gore's The Inconvenient Truth. Do you remember that show?
Sure.
And of course the book and the show, and he did, of course, an incredible job and an incredible environmental leader trying to bring attention to something that needed attention. And I think he made it, you know, in any ways, massive inroads into, you know, the problem of climate change and how to, you know, if there's any way to address it, how to do it. But in the show, he had the hockey stick graph of population growth, which of course went like that. Yep. And then they had the hockey stick graph of climate emissions, which went like that. And then I was waiting for him to talk about
the link
population and climate emissions, but he only talked about climate emissions. And, you know, it kind of leads us into this topic of, you know, the modern environmental movement for the last 20 years, you know, and when I grew up I kind of came of age in the environmental movement, late 70s, early 80s to mid 80s. And you couldn't go to any sort of meeting or any kind of event without everyone was talking about population growth back then. I mean, it was like a common issue of topic. You know, if I went to the Sierra Club or I went here, wherever I went, it was always, everyone was talking about population growth. And overpopulation, of course, and there were almost half as many people, you know, in 1980 as there are now. And now, of course, it's hardly ever talked about anymore. And, you know, one of the things we're going to do on this show is talk about population and population growth. What are your thoughts, you know, on why we don't talk about that issue anymore?
Well, I think first of all, I'm absolutely delighted that you're going to dig into that. And there are some experts. Of course, there are some writers also who have written specifically on the mainstream U.S. environmental movement's abandonment of population as a core concern. They published a paper on that several years ago that I thought was quite brilliant. So I hope you'll be talking to those people in detail, but in a superficial way. You're right. You know, the first Earth Day in 1970, the environmental movement and concerns about population were the same thing. That was one thing. That was one topic of conversation. 50 years later, the population community is totally balkanized. The mainstream environmental community in the U.S., with one narrow exception, the big groups do not touch it, do not acknowledge it, or only sort of in the most tangential and superficial ways. It's not a core area of their programs. You won't see it in their fundraising appeals. You will, for the most part, it will be studiously avoided. And the reasons for that are several, but one of them is it became wildly controversial. Over time, when discussion of population got mixed up with some really hot button issues, immigration politics, abortion politics, when you're talking about any kind of demographic trends, you're inevitably, you know, you're talking about human sexuality. Okay, so there's a concern. The women's rights movement, I mean, so gender relations, gender equity, you know, then people bring in colonialism, racism. There's just a whole bunch of minefields there. And so it became easier, particularly as folks on the far right end of the political spectrum and some people on the far left of the political spectrum got in that mix and started throwing bombs And it became easier for most conservation and environmental organizations to simply say, we'll avoid that. The people who are working on population, those so-called, population groups, they'll deal with that. But we'll keep talking about our issues. And the really interesting thing here, and the irony, is that what are those groups working on? Oh, let's say it's sprawl, it's loss of wildlife habitat, or it's climate issues, or energy, or it's air pollution, or water degradation, or damming wild rivers. Whatever issue you're talking about, it does not matter. If it's about the health of the biotic community of the world, of the earth, of this living community in which we belong, it is affected by human numbers and human behavior. And yet we don't name that problem. To me, it's almost laughable. It's kind of funny. If I was sitting here with you, Gary, and I started to feel chest pains and shortness of breath, and my energy level went way down, and I called the doctor and got an ambulance to go in, I wouldn't want the physician, the ER doctor, I wouldn't want her to say, well, looks like you've got some loss of, some chest pain here, and loss of aerobic capacity. I can give you some pills for that, and we'll treat those symptoms. I would want her to diagnose the heart attack and say, let's treat the source of the issue and not just try to ameliorate the symptoms. And yet, with the population problem, the problem of ecological overshoot, for the most part, we don't name the problem. We just try to treat the symptoms.
Yeah. And of course, you put the word overpopulation in the title. And so that the viewers know, too, this book was launched with an effort about talking about this issue of overpopulation. And on the webpage populationspeakout.org, you can actually see the book and go through it page by page and look at the images if you don't want to go buy it. And so the public can see it that way too. I watched a video. Go ahead.
Can I say something about that? Because I really want to acknowledge our partners. When the Foundation for Deep Ecology decided to work on this issue, just as we did with other projects, when we did Plundering Appalachia, we went to the dozen or so NGOs that were working on mountaintop coal removal mining in Appalachia, said, educate us, let us help produce a book for you and that'll advance your campaign work. And the same thing here. We went to the experts, and we worked with Population Media Center, with Bill Ryerson, and with the other key authors in the book were Eileen Christ, a professor at Virginia Tech, who's written and produced several books on population. And the foreword was contributed by Musimbi Kenyoro, who was the head of the Global Fund for Women, a Kenyan activist for human rights for many decades, brilliant activist. And so we wanted to create a little editorial team that would dig into this issue, again, visually, not with statistics, not with charts, not with data, but with images that could tell this story of where we are on the planet in this particular moment. So, our partners at Population Media Center in particular were crucial in that. They're doing brilliant work around the world, actually, primarily in the underdeveloped world, the developing world. Shout out to them. And
there's a video,
Global Population Speak Out, and populationspeakout.org website.
There's a video of you online giving a talk where you introduced this book, and instead of it a TED Talk, you called it a Fred Talk. So what is FRED? What's that stand for?
Well, it worked in the moment. It may not be humorous here, but I did throw up a kind of a mock TED Talk stylized slide at the beginning of that talk, and talked about Fred Talk being facing the reality of extinction and doom. And I got a laugh out of it. And I was trying to be a little bit light when introducing a pretty serious and a dark subject. We're in this 6th great extinction crisis in Earth history. collapsing biodiversity around the globe. And it's unlike those previous extinction spasms in the geological record. It wasn't caused by an asteroid strike. It's caused simply by people being people through our prosaic actions. Now, there may be some people out there, when there's 7.8 billion people on the planet, there may be one or two who get up in the morning and they scowl at the world and they say, let me see what little bunny I can squish and which endangered species I can extinguish today. But I don't think that's the vast majority of people. People aren't trying to be toxic to the rest of life by getting through our day. We're trying to just, support our families and have a decent quality of life. That is what people do. But it is the aggregate of those prosaic actions of eating and storing our waste and making our energy and producing our stuff and getting rid of that stuff and fighting, warring against each other is a huge source of material throughput through the economy and a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's that war economy is one thing that few people often talk about. Is those prosaic actions of people that in aggregate add up to our weight on the biosphere, which is causing that unraveling of life. So that was the beginning of that Fred Talk, in which I introduced the book's little parable. And one of the unusual things or kind of notable things, and since I wrote it, I'm not a good one to judge whether it works or not. Other readers will have to judge that for themselves. But in bracketing these photo essays and the forward and the afterword and the one substantive essay, the lengthy essay by Bill Ryerson in the book, we bracketed with a parable that opens and closes the book, a sequence of images and just short text. And a video version of that is actually online as well on YouTube. It's called Lord Man, a Parable.
Lord Man, a Parable. In the beginning, the world was whole, and beauty prevailed, life begetting life until the waters, then the lands, were filled with creatures. Myriad were their languages, from the nearly imperceptible song of moss to the bugling of elk. Whales performed their symphonies in the deep. The sounds of life were everywhere. Life pulsed and contracted and flourished through the ages. Eventually, a being appeared who learned to speak and count. For millennia, he lived well among his wild kin. But as his cleverness grew, so did his ambitions, until the day he declared himself ruler of all. Believing the self-deception that his kind was sovereign over the others, he taught his children that the earth had been made for man's use and profit. He no longer recognized his neighbors in the community of life, instead calling them natural resources. His work he named progress. The old religions, which had long tied the human tribe to the other creatures in a circle of reciprocity, were forgotten. Feigning himself Lord Man, he grew ever more clever. He learned to gather and burn fossil fuels made by ancient geological forces. Praise was sung incessantly to the new god, growth. His numbers became multitudes. As the multitudes spread across the face of the earth, the songs of the other creatures grew fewer and fainter. Many voices went permanently quiet, replaced by the sounds of machines, digging, churning, scarring the land, and driving the whales crazy with their noise. Every day, the earth grew poorer, transformed bit by Lord Man's numbers and actions. The seas were emptied of fish and filled with garbage. The trees were replaced by bleeding stumps. The prairies were transformed into feeding factories for the ever-expanding human masses. Smokestacks darkened the skies. No place was sacred no landscape safe from the insatiable creature's thirst for more energy to serve his god of growth. Lord Man tamed rivers, split atoms, decapitated mountains, and stabbed the earth everywhere he thought a vein of fuel lay hidden. When the feverish earth cried out, sending Furies to communicate her distress, Lord Man ignored the growing sickness until it could no longer be denied. Slowly, the scales began to fall from his eyes when he saw famine ravage the land, when he saw precious sources of fresh water disappear, when the longing that gnawed on his spirit made him recall so many creatures that had passed into oblivion. Seeing the effects of his hubris, he began to wonder if his empire was secure. His delusion weakened just enough to reveal the choice before him. Two paths, one leading to an abundant earth filled with birdsong. The other, the way of growth, offered riches for some, misery for many, and ultimate destruction for all his tribe. Would he restrain his numbers and rejoin the community of life as plain member and citizen? Or attempt to engineer all the earth to his will, heeding only the call of more?
The Lord Man being a reference to a John Muir quote, when he talked about if there was a war between the wild beasts and Lord Man, he'd be tempted to side with the bears. In creating a kind of sort of mythic language and a sequence of images, I wanted to try to set up the heart of the book with a story of how we got to be here and how our worldview changed from the way it, the vast majority of human history, how human cultures have thought about the rest of life. And the way we thought about the rest of life, I mean, again, we're being superficial about this. I mean, there's tremendous nuance and depth when you get into the notion of what it is to be indigenous and the breadth and diversity of indigenous cultures. So I know I'm a white guy who's not even a trained anthropologist talking about this in a superficial way. But if you do look at across human cultures and human history, what are those things that characterize land-based, place-based indigenous cultures? Well, one is the characteristic that that land is sacred, that the community of life is sacred. There aren't ideas of this place is sacred and this place should be trashed. It's not worthy of concern. And then there's a second idea, which is the even more crucial one, and then been bolstered really by the modern field of ecological science. It's a very simple idea, but it runs through essentially every indigenous culture. And what's that idea? It is that everything is connected. Everything is connected. And if you think about those two ideas, everything is connected and everything is sacred. If you treat the world that way, it will not look like the way the world is today. The only way you can have a situation like the way the planet looks today is if cultures have taught themselves or developed to think very, very differently about what the earth is. Not a community of life to which we belong, a community of beings to which we are related. No, it is a collection of natural resources, things for humans to develop, exploit, profit from, improve, manage. If the earth is not a community of life that has produced us, nurtured us, and supports us, but rather simply a great factory in the, in the universe that's floating around, and it's here, been getting here to serve us, to support us, then we treat it as a giant, a planetary scale Walmart. Get the stuff. I'm going to get the best deal I can. I'm going to get the most stuff. I'm going to want that doorbuster special.
And you made a nice segue to one of the other topics we want to talk about. And that is sort of, the language that we use and how that's tied to our worldview and how we treat the planet.
When people take living beings and living phenomena, living systems, and they commodify them with language, that is what allows us to kill them in good conscience. And it's not unlike, okay, here you said we could be provocative in this conversation. I'll be provocative, and at least I think it's provocative to say, let's equate this to human genocide. If you want to precipitate a genocide of one people against another, how do you accomplish that? Because people don't naturally want to slaughter their fellow beings. You have to dehumanize the other. You have to make them subhuman. You have to make them scary or dangerous or less than human or something that prevents their progress. You have to make them the other and create cognitive systems in a people that will allow them to kill with impunity, with pride, with esprit de corps. We did it. We did what we needed to do. We cleaned out the vermin, whatever, we were told that the other was. Well, that sort of process is the same one that our language allows us to do, sort of to precipitate the genocide against the natural world that supports us, but also is our relations in the community of life. And it is language that, for the most part, we don't think about at all. I'm going to throw a quote at you. One of my late boss, Doug Tompkins' favorite quotes was from the social critic Neil Evernden. This is pretty close to verbatim, I think, if it's not a direct quote. But Neil Evernden wrote once that the real authorities in a culture are the unexamined assumptions. And in our case, the unexamined assumptions are encoded in our language. So let me give you a few. If we talk about natural resources, we have commodified something that is alive and that we are related to or supports our life. If we use the very simple little preposition our, we need to protect our forests. We need to save our oceans. We've included a possessive in there that suggests that those things belong to humanity, that they are ours, that we own them. If we use the phrase from ecological economics, ecosystem services, for example, that's a very common one in our field. Well, that suggests that the ecosystems that are around us, in which we are embedded, are there to serve us. Now, it's of course absolutely true that we do live fully and totally and completely due to the grace and the benefits and the mercy of wildness, of wild nature that supports our life. But in framing that sort of undergirding, that nurturing, that motherly relationship as one of ecological services, we again put it in that sort of wonky technical language that puts it in an anthropocentric or human-centered frame. And every time we do that, we reinforce this notion that this earth is for us. It's just here, it's for us. It's again, this planetary scale Walmart, this collection of resources to support us, which keeps us from relearning, again, what humans knew for the vast, vast majority of our human history, that we are related to it all. And none of it is outside the bounds of concern. None of it is other. None of it is less than sacred. These ways that language becomes so embedded in our discourse that we don't even think about them, to me is really, if not the central, one of the crucial problems that really the barriers to us moving forward to a world of beauty, integrity, ecological health. You could call it sustainability if you want. That's kind of a damaged goods type phrase, I think now, but we could just call it one of beauty and abundance. And the path toward that future, toward beauty and abundance, in my mind, very much starts with our language that helps us shift our worldview from human-centered to life-centered, where we see the earth not as a commodity for human use and resources and profit, but the community to which we belong.
And this is one of my favorite topics too, and I'll do another mini lecture on this.
Okay,
too.
great. Give me you allow
one of the things that drives me crazy is the continual conversation about how we can only protect the environment if it's good for the economy. And so this entire language about resources and protecting them and creating these alternative economies, and it always has to be about the economy. And yeah, one of the actual big concerns I have, and I want to relate it back to something I said a few minutes ago. When I was growing up in the environmental movement, late 70s and the 80s, we hardly ever talked about the economy. I mean, it was all about the beauty and grandeur and solitude and going outside, and reading Edward Abbey and having these amazing experiences where you felt like you got away and had an authentic, kind of a communal relationship with wild nature. But now, increasingly, the environmental movement in America, these sort of large foundations come in and they do all this polling and they test all these messages, and the messages that pop are about how it's got to be good for the economy. So my concern, though, is that increasingly there's this mass of younger people who are now in their 20s and 30s, and they are the environmental movement in America. And they're being completely entrained, not just in the language of resourcism and economic, how the environment has to save the economy, but it's how they're viewing the world too. No one ever goes for a hike in the mountains and says, by George, this is going to be good for the economy. You go out there because it's beautiful and you get away from people and away from development. And you have this sense of awe and wonder. Another softball. Go ahead and hit it out of the park.
No, I don't think I can hit it out of the park any more than you just did. I think you're absolutely right. That visceral connection with wildness, with wild places and wild creatures, it's crucial, I think, to developing both sort of the language and the internal conversation that a person needs to have, because you slowly shift your worldview. It's not like people wake up one day and say, I've seen the light. It's not, Saul on the road to Damascus. For most people, it's an evolution. And for many of us, it begins with time in wild nature. And what does that do? What does time wild in nature do to our psyche? It reminds us of that fundamental truth. Everything is sacred. Everything is connected. It also, there's a third thing that being in a wild place often does. You're out there in those Colorado mountains and the scale's big. And if you get above tree line and a storm blows in, you realize I'm at the mercy of the elements here. There's not, and that's not a new phenomenon in human history. And there was a fella, a cranky sort from Massachusetts named Henry David Thoreau in the 1840s. He happened to be traveling with an Indian guide, the Native American person, went on an expedition to a mountain called Katahdin. I believe it was 1846 when Thoreau tried to get to the summit. He got actually to the summit ridge line, and what happened to him? He was buffeted by the clouds and the wind and weather. He didn't actually make it to the summit proper, but he was up there. And he called the forces up there titanic. And he wrote so beautifully and eloquently about the sense of proportion and scale that the individual human psyche feels within this backdrop, this context of wild nature. And when he, in the beautiful passages he wrote about the Maine woods, he wrote about that this was no man's garden. with that wild nature of the Maine woods at the time. He called it mossy and moosey. He said this was no man's garden. And he said the elements up there, on the ridgeline were made out of chaos and old night. I mean, who writes like that? He was just a brilliant, brilliant writer. But let's explore why that might be there, that phenomenon. Let me ask you a question. Now, this is kind of an easy one because I happen to know that you're a PhD scientist. So I'm gonna ask you, Gary, do you believe in sort of the evolutionary origins for the diversity of life? Do you believe that the diversity of life that we see on Earth comes through this process of natural selection and evolutionary adaptation over deep time? Or do you believe that, say, the Earth was created in 6 literal days and is about 6,000 years old?
I would definitely lean towards the first. Yeah.
Okay. If we walk down the street in your town and we ask 100 people and we say to those first 100 people, how many of them are going to answer because they're a sort of a new Earth creationist? They believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, sort of from a literal explanation in the Bible, or that they see the beauty and the abundance, the diversity of life on Earth, and the geological and ecological forces that have been in play over millions, billions of years. That is then the process by which we have seen this flowering in diversity. What's the breakdown in those numbers?
I think I've seen polling on this, but I'm not exactly sure. And I think you must know the answer, but I think it's at least a third, if not 40%, don't believe in evolution, but go ahead and give us the answer.
I don't know what the actual number is. I've seen those numbers too. And there's a relatively large percentage that are skeptical of the evolutionary origins of life, but the majority do. I mean, if we go talk to 100 people, well more than half of them are going to say, oh, sure, yeah, absolutely, I believe in evolution. But if you sort of try to plumb that a little deeper, and by the way, in this conversation, I'm not trying to undermine sort of faith communities in any way, because I come from a traditional faith community as well. And to say you believe in evolutionary origins of life doesn't sort of discount the idea of a deity that put that process in motion. So don't want to get step on anybody's toes there. But if you plumb that idea a little farther and you say, okay, you tell me you believe in natural selection and the evolutionary origins of life. Are you related to me? Are we related? And if these things spin a little bit, people will say, well, yeah, I guess so. Then we would have to. But that's about as far as people usually go with it. If you push them, you might get the idea, the acknowledgement that if we take that idea seriously, of evolution seriously, then I am related to you, Gary. I'm related to the folks who are recording this conversation. I'm related to everybody else who's alive right now, distantly, but I am. But if you go beyond that, if you take that evolutionary origin seriously, I'm related to the maple trees that I see, the fall foliage colors out here, to the black bears that live in the woods here, to the belted kingfishers that are flying around the pond, and to the moose that live up in the woods, and to the wolves that live in Canada. I'm related to everything that is alive on Earth right now, and everything that has ever been alive on Earth, in a sense. If you can take that in and embed that and get comfortable with that idea, then it is very hard to have a resourcist worldview, that the natural world is just the other. And you won't use a term like fisheries that commodifies our cousins, marine wildlife that live in the oceans. Our cousins that live in the rivers, our cousins, that live in the woods, our cousins that form the forest. We're related to it all. And that's what helps kind of shift our worldview back to a more indigenous and life-centered and away from a human and resourcist worldview. I think it starts with language.
I want to spend just a few minutes here at the end, talking about your next project. I know you're going to take a job soon with the Northeast Wilderness Trust. And I know you're also involved, and it ties to everything we've said here so far, you're also involved with the Nature Needs Half movement. So tell us a little bit about, where you're going and why you've decided to move in a new direction. Or a similar direction, but with a new organization.
Very similar direction.
Yeah.
Tompkins Conservation that I've worked with for the last 15 years, while I was sort of on the publishing program side and not the direct land protecting side, the overall foundation's efforts were targeted at saving wild places in Chile and South America. And Tompkins Conservation has been wildly successful in doing that. Here was a relatively modestly capitalized family foundation, at least by, new money standards, has been able to protect multiple new national parks and protect over 14 million acres of new public natural areas in Chile and Argentina. That's just on land, and much more with our work to help to create new marine protected areas off the coast of Argentina. So the numbers get much higher. And the result of that is both great for wildness, for ecological recovery, particularly in those areas that have been previously degraded, but also great for local economic vitality. My colleagues in Argentina, the NGO there that's been sort of the in-country member of this Tompkins Conservation Network, is called Rewilding Argentina. They've been doing absolutely brilliant work restoring missing native species into the Ibera marshlands region, helping to create full and functional ecosystems again, restore the ecological health of a system that had been degraded since European colonization, while at the same time promoting ecological vitality in the local communities around the Ibera marshlands, which is one of the largest wetlands complexes in South America. So here, we have got a story to tell here that is just absolutely extraordinary, beginning its benefits for local people, cultural transformation really of an area that was very economically depressed as it becomes an area that supports an extraordinary wildlife watching ecotourism economy, and benefits for ecological recovery. But the root of that, and I give tremendous credit to Christine Tompkins, who runs Tompkins Conservation now, and her late husband, Doug Tompkins, for leading, with one idea. Our conservation work is going to start with a very simple idea: the intrinsic value of nature. Not what nature is for us, can do for us. We know it does all these things for us. But we're going to lead with the idea that nature is valuable in and of itself, regardless of whether we value it. And that sort of informed the ethos of the organization. So starting with saving wild habitat first, and helping then create, local economic vitality as a result of that. It's a very, very different scale of NGO, but it's a Northeast Wilderness Trust is also a land conservation organization, works regionally. I was one of the founding board members 20 or so years ago, and now I'm going to be going to work as a senior fellow with that organization, again, talking about the values of wild nature, the values of wilderness, all the roles that, all the things, the benefits that wild nature brings to humanity and its intrinsic value. And if we are going to sort of reach that idea of abundant earth, of beautiful, ecologically robust, diverse, and extraordinarily a resilient community of life that Eileen Christ writes about in her book, In Abundant Earth, if we're going to get there, it's going to mean that we allow, not only that we reduce human numbers and reduce human consumption, the way we are and how many we are, but also that we accord our relatives in the community of life space enough to flourish. That means protected areas, conservation land, wilderness, self-willed land, wild nature, wild habitat. It means wrapping the earth eventually in at least half of the earth in these big, beautiful ribbons of wildness, of protected areas on land and on sea. And that will only happen incrementally, place by place, as individuals and groups work to save and conserve the places they love. But incrementally, as these knit up into a half Earth or nature needs half vision, there should be enough habitat to prevent other species from going extinct because of our behavior and numbers. That's the long-term vision. Is space enough for all to flourish, for every species to have the right to life, liberty, and habitat? And wilderness is part of that equation.
Yeah, and I would like to note too that while this concept might seem pretty grandiose, there are definitely paths forward to get there, and there are people working on it. In fact, there was a bill. It was actually a resolution bill in the United States Senate just this a few months ago, and it was kind of called the 30 by 30 bill. And it was like, try to preserve 30% of America by 2030. And one of my United States senators here in Colorado, Michael Bennett, was a co-sponsor of that bill. And in the bill, they also mentioned the goal of getting towards 50 by 50, so half of the planet by the year 2050. And so even in the incredible, chaotic, and dysfunctional political times that we live, there are definitely, ideas that are not just grandiose ideas that are being, people like you and me are talking about, but there's bills in the U.S. Senate right now to deal with those. So your book, I want to just talk about this Lord Man concept, and we'll kind of finish up on this. In the beginning of the book, you talk about how this notion of man being, the Lord of all the landscape, and how humans are domineering everything, and how this language and worldview has led us into this, increasingly apocalyptic treatment of the planet. And then at the end, because our show is called Overcoming Overshoot, we're try to end on something positive every time, and how we're going to overcome this. At the end, you kind of flip the language and talk about how we can get away from this concept of man as Lord and get to one more of a symbiosis and a respect for the beauty and bounty around us. So just tell us a little bit about the end of the book and your thinking, and why you decided to end it that way.
Well, we decided to end it that way because we, the editorial group that worked on the book, was because we wanted to present, after this very, grim photo treatment of the earth as transformed by human numbers and behavior, with a sense that there is possibility. The earth does not have to look this way. Rewilding is possible. We can not only help to restore the beauty and bounty and integrity of life on earth, we can help rewild ourselves. Rewilding the earth begins with rewilding our hearts and minds, and helping to sort of undomesticate ourselves, as we domesticated ourselves 10 or 12,000 years ago, and that's been part of our problem ever since. But that can be undone, and it's undone every time we consciously help acknowledge that connection. Outside here, I'm hearing birdsong through my window. My cousins are out here talking to each other. But every time I walk through my woods and I acknowledge my neighbors, whether it's moss or moose, I'm starting to help recreate in myself the idea of being a person in relationship with all my neighbors in the community of life, and not the manager of them, not the lord of them, not the technocrat that's going to oversee them, but a good member and good neighbor in their community, and a good cousin. And that's possible, I think, also on a planetary scale. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean it's not going to be difficult. But this human population bottleneck, if we can get through it with some modicum of dignity and humanity, and throw a lot more resources at root problems, we can get back to that world of beauty and integrity where a flourishing humanity is embedded in the community of life. There are ways to get there. All of them start with behaving better, with more kindness, with more empathy. And a lot of them also start with, the Lord man is a gendered term, again, coming from the Muir quote, but it was intentional, because a lot of these problems also come from a patriarchal worldview. You got to overcome that as well. And if we throw our energies and our capacities at promoting gender equity, at promoting universal human rights framework that allows for reproductive autonomy and makes reproductive family planning skills and methods and technologies and education universally available, that supports people, particularly in the underdeveloped world, who need more resources. And particularly if those of us in the overdeveloped world, in the affluent world, start to rein in our excessive and rapacious consumption, which is a very tough nut, but absolutely fundamental to the issue as well. If we can do that, we can start to change that trajectory of demography, add on sort of replacing the current toxic energy economy, which was one supported by renewables, and add on a wholesale effort in natural climate solutions, and including lots more land and marine conservation. That helps to naturally sequester carbon and soak up atmospheric carbon dioxide. You save a lot more wild ocean, a lot more wild land, get our human numbers under control, reform the toxic energy economy, and promote gender equity, and we can turn the tide.
Wonderful. So as a reminder, this is the book, Overdevelopment, Overpopulation, Overshoot. You can buy it online, or you can go to the website populationspeakout.org and look through it there by page. Tom, this has been an absolutely delightful conversation, and I really appreciate your time. And like you said, I think we could have picked any one of these topics and gone on for hours and hours on each of them, but it's been just a wonderful, delightful time to visit with you. We wish you great success in your next adventure in at the Northeast Wilderness Trust, and hopefully we can have you back on the show sometime.
Hey, thank you, Gary, and good luck with your efforts here. It was delightful to chat with you.
All right, thanks for being on EarthX TV and watching Overcoming Overshoot.